The night the rain came down like shards of broken glass, Clara May's screams echoed through the hollowed hills of eastern Kentucky. The cabin's thin wooden walls barely held back the storm, and the single oil lamp flickered in protest as if the light itself feared what was being born. The midwife, old and trembling, refused to meet Clara's eyes. She had delivered hundreds of children in her time, but none under a silence this thick, none surrounded by whispers this heavy. No father waited on the porch. No kin came to help. Only the endless woods, watching from beyond the window. Clara May was only 16 when the first signs began to show. Her mother, Ruth, noticed it before she did, the way Clara's dresses began to fit tighter, the way her appetite grew, the way she stared at the horizon longer than usual as if waiting for someone who would never come. In the isolated Appalachian cabin where they lived, the nearest neighbor was miles away, and gossip traveled slower than the fog that rolled through the valleys. But whispers have a way of finding even the most hidden corners, and soon the townsfolk began to talk about the preacher's quiet niece who had suddenly become reclusive, avoiding the Sunday sermons she once never missed. Ruth asked her daughter again and again who the father was, but Clara's silence was a wall no question could climb. Her eyes would fill with tears, yet no name ever left her lips. The older woman prayed for strength, knowing what people would think, knowing how they would turn their backs once they decided for themselves what kind of sin had taken place in that cabin deep in the woods. When the time came, the pain came too, sharp, relentless, and echoing through the walls as thunder cracked outside. The rain poured like the heavens themselves had opened in judgment. Clara's mother called for the midwife, but no one else came, and in that tiny one-room cabin the air grew thick with fear. Clara screamed until her voice broke, gripping the sheets until her knuckles turned white, her body trembling not just from labor but from the dread of what she was bringing into the world. The midwife's hands shook as she worked, glancing at Ruth with eyes full of questions she dared not ask. Hours passed before the cries of a newborn finally pierced the storm. The baby's first breath came as lightning split the sky, and for a moment, all sound vanished, just the soft, wet gasp of new life, then silence so heavy it felt alive. Clara turned her face to the wall, refusing to look. She knew that if she saw the child, she would never be able to forget what that face might reveal. The midwife hesitated before handing the baby to Ruth, her lips tightening as she studied its features, something unreadable flickering in her expression. Ruth took one look and gasped softly, clutching the child tighter against her chest. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything, recognition, horror, and grief tangled together. Clara felt her mother's trembling but said nothing. She knew that whatever had been born that night was more than just a child. It was the weight of a secret that could never be spoken, a living reminder of the darkness that sometimes hides inside a family's bloodline, waiting for the right night to be reborn. By the time Clara May's baby reached its second month, the quiet mountain town had already begun to feed on whispers. In a place where everyone knew everyone, secrets were currency, and Clara's silence had made her the richest girl in the valley. She rarely left her cabin now, only venturing into town when the baby needed milk or when Ruth forced her to attend Sunday service. Every time she walked down the narrow dirt path toward the chapel, conversations would die mid-sentence. Old women would lower their eyes but lean closer to one another as she passed, their hands tightening around their prayer books. The men on the porch outside the general store would stop whittling, watching her with curiosity sharpened by suspicion. The same question burned on every tongue: who was the father of that baby? Some said it was a traveling peddler who had stopped through in the spring, a man no one remembered seeing again. Others swore it had to be someone local because of how quickly Ruth had shut her daughter away once the pregnancy became impossible to hide. Then came the darker theories, the ones whispered over fences and under breath when night fell and lanterns dimmed. They said the baby had a strange look to it, something not quite right about its eyes, and that Clara's refusal to name the father wasn't modesty, it was protection. People began recalling stories they'd once dismissed, tales about the family's long history of keeping to themselves, of never marrying outside their own bloodline. Someone mentioned the name Elias, the uncle who had returned from prison not long before Clara's belly began to swell. That was when the rumors turned poisonous. The preacher's wife claimed she'd seen Elias standing behind the cabin one evening, smoking and watching the window where Clara used to sit. Another woman insisted she'd found two sets of footprints by the riverbank, one small and one much larger, both leading toward the woods and never returning. By summer's end, the town's curiosity had hardened into judgment. Mothers pulled their children away when Clara passed, and the church pew that once held her family sat empty, collecting dust and silence. Ruth, once respected as a God-fearing woman, now found herself unwelcome at the market, her greetings met with curt nods and averted gazes. In a place built on faith and gossip, Clara's baby had become a living accusation, a reminder of sin that couldn't be buried deep enough. The woods behind their home seemed to listen to the whispers too, holding the secrets the townsfolk feared to speak aloud, waiting for the day when truth would finally echo back out from the trees. Sheriff Amos Harlan had lived his whole life in the same mountain valley where Clara May was born, and he'd seen his share of scandals, but something about this one gnawed at him differently. He wasn't a cruel man, just one who believed that even secrets left to rot could eventually poison an entire town. When word reached him that people were whispering Elias Porter's name in connection to the girl's mysterious pregnancy, he decided to look into it, not because he wanted trouble, but because he could smell it coming. Elias had only been out of prison for a few months, serving nearly a decade for theft and assault. He'd returned to his sister Ruth's cabin like a ghost nobody asked for, leaner, harder, and quieter than anyone remembered. Some folks said he'd changed in prison, others said the time alone had made him more dangerous. The sheriff started with the basics: dates, visits, and sightings. He asked the midwife when Clara had given birth, did the math backward, and realized the conception would have happened just a few weeks after Elias came home. That wasn't proof, but it was enough to stir unease. When he stopped by Ruth's cabin, the air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood and fear. Clara barely looked up from rocking the baby, her eyes hollow and distant, as though she were somewhere far away. Ruth answered for her daughter, voice steady but thin, saying the father was nobody's concern, that the man was gone and would never come back. Harlan noticed the tremor in her hands when she said it. He left that day with more questions than answers, but one thing he knew for sure: the story didn't fit. A few days later, he found Elias at the edge of the woods, cutting timber. When asked where he'd been during those months, Elias smiled a slow, cold smile and said, working, same as now, but offered no proof. His eyes, a pale gray like winter river water, gave nothing away, but his tone carried a quiet warning. The sheriff saw the bruises on his knuckles, the faint scar running across his jaw, and couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing too close to a man who had done something terrible and learned how to live with it. That night, Harlan wrote in his logbook, Elias Porter, watch closely. He couldn't prove it yet, but his gut told him the truth was tangled somewhere in that cabin, between Ruth's silence, Clara's fear, and Elias's grin. The mountains kept their secrets well, but every secret left a trail, and the sheriff was starting to see where this one led. The night the baby disappeared began like any other, heavy with rain and silence. The storm rolled in over the ridge just after dusk, its thunder crawling low and distant like something alive. Clara May sat by the fire with her child pressed against her chest, humming an old lullaby her mother used to sing. Ruth had gone to bed early, worn down from weeks of worry and sleeplessness. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, and every so often, the baby stirred, whimpering softly before falling quiet again. It was a fragile piece, one Clara clung to desperately, as if the song might keep away the things she feared most, her memories, the whispers, the feeling that someone was always watching from the woods. Sometime past midnight, the fire began to fade, and Clara's eyes grew heavy. She didn't remember falling asleep, only the sound of rain on the roof and a faint creak somewhere near the door. When she woke, the air felt wrong. The cabin was darker than it should have been, and the silence had a strange, hollow weight to it. The baby's crib was empty. At first, she thought her mother had taken him, maybe to calm his cries, but Ruth's door was closed, and no light came from beneath it. Panic surged through her chest as she tore through the room, calling his name again and again. Though the baby had no name yet, she'd never been able to choose one. The only answer was the storm outside and the wind pushing at the windows like impatient hands. She ran out into the rain barefoot, her nightgown clinging to her skin, screaming until her throat went raw. The forest loomed at the edge of the clearing, dark and endless. Lightning flashed once, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw something, a shape moving between the trees, small and quick, wrapped in something white. Then it was gone. By the time the sheriff arrived hours later, the rain had washed away every footprint, every trace. Ruth sat by the cold hearth, whispering prayers, her eyes blank and hollow. Clara, soaked and shivering, kept repeating the same thing over and over, that she'd only closed her eyes for a moment, that the baby had been right there, breathing, alive. But when she said it, her voice trembled in a way that made even the sheriff uneasy, as if she wasn't entirely sure whether the baby had been taken, or had simply vanished on its own, called back into the same darkness that had brought it into the world. The first time Clara May heard the baby's cries, she thought she was dreaming. It was late, long after the sheriff had given up the search and the neighbors had stopped visiting. The woods outside had returned to their usual quiet, broken only by the croak of frogs and the distant rush of the creek. She had been sitting alone by the window, staring into the blackness, her hands trembling around a cold cup of tea. Then came the sound, soft at first, faint and muffled, like a memory forcing its way back into her mind. It was the unmistakable cry of a newborn, high-pitched and fragile, cutting through the wind. Her heart stopped. The crib beside the fire was still empty, untouched since that night. But from somewhere beyond the trees, the crying grew louder, desperate, and real. She ran outside barefoot, the damp earth cold against her skin. The moon hid behind a veil of clouds, and the air smelled of rain and rot. Each step she took deeper into the forest made the sound clearer, the rhythm of those cries pulling her forward like a rope. "I'm coming," she whispered, though her voice shook, unsure whether she was answering her child or something else entirely. The sound led her to the old sycamore tree by the creek, the same place where she and Elias used to meet when the nights were warm and her heart was still innocent. But now the clearing was empty, only the water rushing below and the sound fading into the wind. She stood there for a long time, listening, trembling as the echoes seemed to come from every direction at once. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the crying stopped. The forest fell silent again, heavy and watchful. When she returned to the cabin, Ruth was waiting by the door, pale as chalk. She said nothing, only took Clara's hands in her own and whispered that she'd heard it too. That night neither of them slept. The next evening, it happened again, the same cry, the same voice carried through the pines, sometimes closer, sometimes far away. Days turned into weeks, and the cries continued, always after midnight, always from the woods. The sheriff stopped believing her, claiming it was grief playing tricks on her mind. But Clara knew what she heard. Each time the voice called, it was clearer, more familiar, and sometimes she swore she could hear her own name in between the wails. It wasn't just the sound of a lost baby anymore. It was something else, something that wanted her to follow, something that had crawled out of the dark soil of those mountains to remind her that blood never really lets go. It was a month after the baby vanished when Clara May found the photograph. She had been cleaning through her mother's old chest, trying to rid the house of anything that still smelled like sorrow, when she discovered it tucked between the pages of a worn family Bible. The picture was old, sepia-toned, fraying at the edges, the kind that seemed to trap ghosts more than memories. It showed her grandparents standing in front of the same cabin she now lived in, their faces stern and cold, surrounded by children whose expressions were far too serious for their age. But what caught Clara's eye wasn't the faces of the adults, it was the youngest boy, standing off to the side, his head slightly bowed, his eyes oddly shaped, as if the bone beneath didn't quite fit the way it should. The longer she looked, the more her stomach turned, because she'd seen that same strange shape before. She remembered it in the few brief moments she had dared to look at her baby, in the tilt of his head, the peculiar angle of his gaze. At the time, she had brushed it off as the trick of a shadow, the strain of exhaustion. But now, staring at that faded photograph, she realized it wasn't her imagination. It was something that had lingered through generations, a mark that refused to die with time. She dug deeper into the chest, pulling out more photos, faces of uncles, cousins, grandparents, all wearing that same faint distortion, something just slightly off, something you couldn't name but couldn't unsee once you noticed. It was in the way their eyes set too close together, or how their smiles never quite reached both sides of their mouths. The discovery left her breathless. She began to understand what people in town whispered about her family, the reason they lived so far up in the hills and married among themselves for decades. It wasn't only pride or isolation, it was something darker, something that had twisted its way into their very blood. Ruth caught her with the photo later that evening, and when Clara demanded to know the truth, her mother's face went pale. She tried to take the photograph away, but Clara held tight, trembling as tears filled her eyes. Ruth finally whispered that some things were meant to stay buried, that the past was better left where it belonged. But Clara couldn't let it go. That night, as she lay awake, the image haunted her, the eyes of that boy in the photograph staring back at her, hollow and familiar. She could see her child's face in his, as if time itself had looped back to remind her that what was gone was never truly gone, and that some bloodlines carry their sins in the bones. Clara May couldn't sleep after finding the photograph. Every creak of the cabin seemed to echo with the weight of all the faces she'd seen, faces that looked too much like her own, too much like her baby's. The discovery gnawed at her until she could no longer keep quiet. She began asking questions her mother refused to answer, digging into stories the elders used to tell in hushed tones by the fire. But no one wanted to talk. Some turned away when she approached, others crossed themselves as she passed. It became clear to her that whatever secret her family carried was older than anyone alive, older than the cabin itself. One night, she went to see old Widow Crane, the oldest woman in the valley, who had known her grandparents when they were young. The widow hesitated at first, but the look in Clara's eyes, half desperation, half dread, made her speak. What she told her chilled Clara to the bone. The Porter family, she said, had been different from the start. They settled in those hills long before there were proper towns, keeping to themselves, marrying within the bloodline to preserve what they called the strength of their kin. But the isolation had done something to them, warped them in ways that weren't just physical. Strange births, disappearances, children born without names, it all stretched back generations. The old woman spoke of nights when cries were heard from the woods, of people who went missing and were never found, and of a curse whispered to cling to the Porter blood. It was said that the family's patriarch had once made a pact with something in the mountains, something that promised prosperity in exchange for loyalty to their own blood and no one else's. Over the years, that promise had twisted into an obsession, until the family forgot where the line between devotion and damnation truly was. Clara left the widow's house trembling, the air thick with the smell of rain and decay. The path back home felt longer that night, and the woods seemed to breathe around her, every branch groaning like an old memory. When she returned, she found Ruth waiting by the door, as if she already knew where her daughter had been. Clara demanded the truth one last time, and this time Ruth didn't deny it. Her voice was a whisper, cracked and hollow, as she confessed that their family had always been its own world, untouched by outsiders, and that the reason she had hidden Clara's parentage wasn't shame, it was fear. Clara realized then that she wasn't just part of a family tainted by sin. She was the product of generations bound by a secret that had long since turned into something monstrous, something that still breathed within her blood. The sheriff returned to the Porter cabin a few weeks after Clara's late-night visits to Widow Crane. He had been hearing new rumors, darker than before, talk of strange sounds coming from beneath the cabin, of flickering lantern light seen through the cracks in the floorboards long after midnight. Clara had grown thinner, her eyes hollow and fevered, her voice trembling when she spoke. Ruth refused to let him inside at first, claiming they had nothing left to hide, but the sheriff's curiosity had turned to suspicion. He'd spent enough years in those hills to know when something wasn't right. When he finally stepped through the door, the smell hit him first, damp earth, mildew, and something metallic beneath it, faint but unmistakable. He followed that scent to a patch of floor where the wood looked newer than the rest, the planks mismatched, nailed down hurriedly as if to cover something up. Ruth tried to stop him, her hands shaking as she begged him to leave it alone, but the sheriff pried the boards loose one by one. Beneath them, a narrow opening yawned into darkness, a hidden cellar, dug deep into the ground. The air that rose from it was cold and still, untouched for years. He lit his lantern and descended the steps, each creak echoing in the hollow space below. What he found there made his skin crawl. The walls were lined with old jars filled with strange things, animal bones, bits of cloth, locks of hair. In one corner stood a small wooden cradle, long rotted but still intact, its frame covered in names carved by hand, dates stretching back nearly a century. Some of those names were repeated over and over, passed from father to son, mother to daughter, as if the same lives kept cycling through generations. At the far end of the cellar, a pile of brittle papers sat beneath a rusted lantern. He lifted one and saw it was a ledger, written in Ruth's handwriting, but the records began decades before her birth. Each page listed family unions, detailing marriages and births, all within the same bloodline. Some pages were crossed out, as if someone had tried to erase them from memory. When the sheriff looked up, Ruth was standing at the top of the stairs, tears streaking her face. She whispered that those records were never meant for anyone outside the family, that they were meant to keep track of the blood that belonged. Clara appeared beside her, pale and shaking, realizing in that moment that everything she'd feared was true. Their family hadn't just hidden from the world out of shame or tradition. They had built an entire legacy underground, a history of love turned into madness, bound together by walls of dirt and silence that had finally begun to crack open. Clara May sat by the table that night, the old ledger spread open before her, the candlelight trembling like a heartbeat. The sheriff had taken what he needed and left, promising to return with questions she didn't want to answer. But Clara couldn't look away from the pages, from the looping names and careful handwriting that chronicled her family's past in blood and ink. The same few names kept repeating, generation after generation, like a curse that refused to die. Her mother's name appeared several times, but what made her stomach twist was seeing her own written there long before she was born, beside another name, Elias Porter. Next to them, written in the same shaky hand, were the words, unholy but bound. She ran her fingers over the ink, the letters bleeding faintly under her touch, and the truth hit her with a force that stole her breath. Elias wasn't just her uncle. He was her father. She wanted to deny it, to believe it was some mistake, but every page that followed told the same story. The family had woven a pattern of lies so deep that even the truth looked like fiction. The realization burned through her, and suddenly everything made sense, the way Ruth had avoided his eyes after his release from prison, the way Elias had always lingered a little too long when he spoke to her, the way her mother's voice had cracked whenever she called him brother. Clara remembered that night months ago, the one she'd buried deep in her mind, when Elias had come to her door drunk and whispering that no one else would ever understand their kind. She had been too frightened, too confused to stop him. Now, the memory returned in full, and it felt like the air itself turned against her. She stumbled outside, the cold night cutting into her skin, her body trembling with rage and disgust. The woods seemed to close in around her, branches reaching out like fingers, whispering the same word over and over, *blood star. She could almost hear his voice again, low and broken, calling her name the way he used to. Inside the cabin, Ruth sobbed quietly, knowing the secret she had spent her life protecting had finally been unearthed. Clara didn't return to the house until dawn, her feet caked with mud, her mind spinning. The sun rose pale over the trees, but the light didn't bring peace. She now carried the weight of generations on her shoulders, the proof that her entire life had been built on deceit, and the child she had born was the final echo of that sin, a child made not from love, but from a family's endless loop of shame and silence. The nights grew longer after the truth came out, and Clara May stopped speaking altogether. The sheriff never returned, and the townsfolk no longer came near the cabin. The forest seemed to grow thicker around it, as if nature itself wanted to swallow what was left of the Porter family. Ruth grew sick, coughing blood into her handkerchief and praying louder with each passing day, begging God to forgive what she had allowed. But Clara no longer prayed. She spent her night sitting by the window, staring into the woods where she'd first heard her baby's cries. Though weeks had passed since the last sound, she still felt a pull, a connection she couldn't explain. Then one night, as the wind moaned through the trees, she heard it again, the unmistakable cry of a child. It was louder this time, closer, almost calling to her. She rose without thinking, her feet carrying her to the door as if her body no longer belonged to her. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The moon hung low, pale and swollen, and the woods shimmered with fog. The cries came from deep within, the same place where she'd once seen the faint white shape move between the trees. "I'm coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. She followed the sound, each step sinking into the soft ground. The further she went, the quieter the forest became, until only the baby's voice remained, echoing faintly ahead. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement, small and pale, crawling through the mist near the old sycamore by the creek. Her heart pounded as she approached, tears burning her eyes. The baby was there, wrapped in the same quilt she'd stitched with her mother before the birth. But when she knelt to pick him up, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the woods fell deathly silent. The child's skin was ashen, his eyes too bright, reflecting the moonlight in a way no living eyes should. He smiled, small, deliberate, knowing, and the sound that came from him was not a cry but a breathless whisper that sent chills down her spine. "Mama," it said, the voice both hers and his, echoing from somewhere beyond. She froze, unable to move, as the figure in her arms began to fade, melting into the fog until all that remained was the echo of his laughter and the scent of the earth. When Clara returned home at dawn, her dress was damp and torn, her eyes empty. She told Ruth that the baby was alive, that he had been waiting in the woods all along, cared for by something older than any man, something that had never left the Porter bloodline. And as the first light of morning touched the trees, the faint sound of a baby's cry rose again from the forest, soft and eternal, like the echo of a curse that would never end.